The film industry in New Zealand has like very simply, three strands. There are the foreign-generated films that use New Zealand as a location, and that creates a lot of work. There are the new films made by New Zealanders for an international audience, like The Hobbit and Avatar. We count James Cameron as he lives in New Zealand now. And there are people like Andrew Adamson, who's just made a film from our part of the world called Mr. Pip, which relates to a novel, but he's famous for directing Shrek and Adventures of Narnia. So those are New Zealanders who make films in the international film industry. And then the last strand, I think you would describe as New Zealand filmmakers who want to give expression to New Zealand culture and New Zealand stories. And that's for the world as well as for New Zealanders. There are several options if you want to make a film. The first one is to do what Alyx did, which is just go and make it. There is a limited amount of government money to subsidise our film industry for us to have Indigenous films. The size of our country is so small, it's only 4 million people, that it is impossible to make a film commercially, really. Even the ones that do very, very well, are very successful, wouldn't be able to recover their budget in New Zealand. So all our films we have to make so that they are partly subsidised by the government, but they have to also appeal to a wider audience. So we're looking for international sales agents and distributors to help us make our films.
And the government funding is the New Zealand Film Commission?
Yes.
Otherwise, unlike in Germany, there's only one funding body who's doing it all.
And it can't do very much, actually. Yeah. It doesn't have a lot of money. So there's a lot of people who aspire to make films in New Zealand. Peter Jackson has become a hero that has created dreams for everybody, I think. But it means that it's very competitive and difficult. But New Zealanders are very resourceful people, and many people, and both Renae and Alyx have just made them, just gone ahead and done it. And I guess I have as well.
Yeah, and here you are, all three of you. Yeah, that was definitely something when I was in New Zealand that impressed and inspired me most, really that just do it sense. When you come from Germany, and I think that might be, personally speaking, that might be something that the Germans are fascinated and freed by, is the sense of, well, just do it. And really starting to do it, and it works out. Actually, well, most of the time. It's a constructive way, instead of thinking about why you shouldn't do it, which we are very good at. So that's, it's really like a whole nation with that spirit. And that's actually a really good point to pass on the microphone to Alyx, because you just really did it with Alyx won Best Self-Funded Film at the New Zealand Film Festival for her film. Can you tell us a little bit how you did it without any funding and how the process was?
I mean, in a way the film is not truly self-funded, not entirely. So I started off with the intention of making a short documentary, and I had some funding from Creative New Zealand. At the time that there's Creative New Zealand and there's the New Zealand Film Commission, and Creative New Zealand covers a range of mediums. So art, so dance, theatre, visual arts, music, and at that time, film. Now they do not fund film so much. That's been given purely to the Film Commission. But when I applied, I had a small grant to create a short documentary. I started to do that and then realised that the arc of my story for that documentary was not going to work. That what I thought was going to happen wasn't going to happen. So I went back to Creative New Zealand and said, look, I would like to make, I think there is a good story here, but it's a fiction. I would like to make a feature. May I continue to use this little amount of money but carry on myself? And they said, okay. and so I did. So I got an artist residency in China to do one section of the film, well, to do the research. I got a post-production grant from Creative New Zealand for some of the offline. I put in about 50% of the budget myself, and I had 4 small grants from Asia, New Zealand. So it was about doing it step by step, collecting bits of money along the way, and also I think the thing that's most important, and I think this is touching on the do-it-yourself thing, is you do it yourself, but you do it yourself within a community. So it's about, it is a small place, and we know each other, and we help each other. So I have some amazing collaborators that I greatly appreciate who will continue to work on my projects. And actually one of them is here. Katie is in the audience, and she's done some amazing post-production compositing for me for previous projects. So it is, yeah, it's sort of a community-based or community process, I guess, of making a film.
Yeah, yes, sure. Mm-hmm.
I also think that people are surprised when they come from other filmmaking communities to discover how much people who are very skilled and experienced, like the masters of our film industry, will still work on people's short films because they're very committed to the next generation of filmmakers. So, well, in other countries, I think that often you've got everybody is a new filmmaker that works on a new film, but in New Zealand you get a lot of assistance from the technical and creative heads of department will give their time for virtually nothing because they're very committed to our Indigenous community, our Indigenous filmmaking.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, when I was over there, I met so many people who somehow did have had worked with Peter Jackson, and other people who were involved in films were professionals, helped out, and that's true. It's a very pragmatic reason, probably why short films in New Zealand are so on such high quality standards. I mean, it's one, not explaining everything, but it is really because professionals are involved in that sense of being a part and helping out, yeah. How you also self-distributed your film in 35 cinemas, you said? How was that? And also the second question after that, how was your effort and success with the Red House received in New Zealand? Also on a film, maybe on a political level as a...
So once, I think there's something in New Zealand, when something independent comes up, people like to support it. So it went and it premiered at the New Zealand Film Festival, and then it had some very good reviews. Like all the reviewers came and, you know, praised it. And so at that point I thought, okay, I should take it as far as I can take it. You know, it's already taken 4 years to make. There's no point stopping here. So I did a self-distributed release in about 35 New Zealand cinemas, which for me was a very good experience because it meant that I got to talk to all the cinema owners and hear their side of the business. I got to meet a lot of New Zealand audiences by touring around with it and doing Q&As and feeling how a film like this is received. You know, a story that's set in New Zealand about an older couple who have to move, and so I guess I felt like I got to understand a lot better aspects of my own country and aspects of my own culture, both from the industry side of the cinema owners and also the audiences who wanted to support it. So it did very well. For a little budget movie, it went quite wide. Yeah.
Yes, please.
I was just going to say that most of the films that get released in our cinemas, of course, are from America usually, and they come with all their marketing in place. So any New Zealand film is competing against the big power of Hollywood in our own cinemas. And so all New Zealand films and filmmakers work very closely with the distributors. And for us with The Orator, I would have to congratulate the distributors who were thinking, how do we get people to a Samoan language film? And sort of the distributor knew how to work the art house market, but he really put a huge amount of effort from good 6 months before release into building within the Polynesian communities a knowledge about the film. So he was very lateral thinking and innovative, and I think that characterises a lot of what we do in the face of very big powers, commercial powers from overseas. We do think just because they're bigger than us doesn't mean to say we can't do things our way.
Yeah. And yeah, to add to that, I think it is about finding the audiences in without the money. It's not like you can put it out there through big posters everywhere or put adverts on TV or whatever. So it is relying on a grassroots method through word of mouth. So with the Red House, for example, I started just in 10 cinemas, and I asked the cinemas to not play it very much. Play it only like at the most twice a day, and maybe not every day, but to have a long run, because my feeling was I'm not going to be able to have the audience know that it's there on the first weekend, and usually you try to you put it out on 40 screens and you get everybody to come and you get your biggest box office in the first weekend. But I thought, well, I can't do that. I don't have the money behind it. So I encouraged word of mouth to be the thing that got it out there. And so then, in one cinema it lasted 12 weeks in Wellington. And so it just gradually grew and grew and grew and grew. And yeah, the word got out.
It's really funny because that's exactly how I got to find your film, because I talked within about, 8 weeks, I talked to 3 people who told me the Red House is really good, you should go and see it. It was really word of mouth, and that's how I got in the cinema finally after the 4th person. Yes. Renae.
Yes.
Now, you are the Maihi filmmaker here in the room.
Yes.
And there's Maihi funds. Well, Catherine is actually working on many, mostly Maihi or Pacifica stories as well. Tell us a little bit about that. What is it to make Maihi films in New Zealand?
Just want to quickly add something that was that Catherine and Alyx had talked about, the way that our industry works. I had lots of very experienced people who were working on my film, and I was so grateful, and I couldn't pay anybody, so I paid them with food, with kai, and I guess that kind of sums up really the way that Māori are, is that as long as you fill everyone's bellies, they'll be happy. But I was speaking with one of my crew, and I said, look, thank you so much for coming and helping us out with the shoot. And he said to me, oh no, it's all right, I've got a rule. He said, I've got to give back twice per year, do 2 freebies per year, because it helps the industry regenerate. And so, I just wanted to support that kōrero, what was just said. But in terms of Māori filmmaking or funding, I mean, I went through the New Zealand Film Commission, which is not specifically Māori funding. I don't know whether they do set aside, Catherine will know more about that than I do, but yeah, I just put my script in, really. It all comes down to the script, and I don't know if I'm answering your question properly, but so you asked me what the funding.
Well, basically, I mean, there is I was thinking that there was a special fund for Maori films. Is that not? If that's not true, then if I didn't
just
do my
recently, one of the organisations called Ngā Whakare, which is was established to advocate for Māori within film and television. Just recently, they had an initiative called Ngā Aho Shorts, which was designed to give $30,000 towards filmmakers of Māori descent from the rural areas. But because I lived within Auckland, I wasn't eligible for that. No, but yes, no, I don't know. Catherine can probably answer that question much better than I can.
I guess I don't see it so much as, you know, whether there's government incentivised Māori or Pacific stories, but the stories from the Pacific are, on the whole, a really fresh angle on the world. They're a way of our unique environment and adding to that's something we can show the world as stories that come from a culture where we are lots of different peoples who live together and work together and have found a way of living together. We all, like any family, knock about it a bit, but on the whole I think that New Zealanders work very well together. I mean, no doubt New Zealanders in the audience. So there are very many peoples making up New Zealand, and the connection of those people is what makes the films unique.
Yeah, I'll just add. Because, you know, we're very intermarried as well. Like, my grandfather is a 6 foot tall white man, you know. So, as Catherine said, yeah, I don't just specifically look at myself as a Māori filmmaker or a Māori playwright. I am Māori, and I do tell Māori stories because I guess that's my experience in the world, but eventually I want to, you know, move past and just tell stories of the world about people. This first film which I directed, I guess, was an exploration of something that I found so beautiful about the form of poi, and also it came from going on Google and writing Māori women are, and in the drop-down box, when I had came up with words like ugly, disgusting, and it was really hurtful to me because I thought, why is this this perception of Māori women? Māori women are beautiful. If you come to New Zealand, you'll see a lot of gorgeous-looking Māori women who are strong and intelligent women. And so I guess I made this film because I wanted the world to see just how beautiful our young women are. Yeah.
Thank you. And I would like to re-ask you a question that I asked you for the interview for Arte. Because then we were talking about Maori storytelling, and I was asking you, and I'm asking you again, what is the special thing about Maori storytelling? Because you too mentioned the storytelling, and that's something that I did find fascinating as well. And there's some difference in New Zealand films and New Zealand storytelling, which I would just, which also is in Maori storytelling. Could you try and explain why, what that is, or that might be?
So, I was just talking with Catherine about this recently. You know, we're very close as whānau. My sister currently is raising her son in Sweden, and she's pining for home because we raise our babies together. when we get together, we karakia, we pray together, we share stories together. I grew up, my father is one of 13 children, and my uncles, oh goodness, they would tell us ghost stories, and this is how it was for generations. We would sit around the fire and tell stories of, you know, of the past, of our ancestors, of the naughty things that they got up to, jokes, and so we were constantly sharing stories, but also I think the point of difference, or we all have it, each culture has it, but is our relationship with the world around us, and our connectedness with everything around us. So, for example, with Māori children, if this one little boy says, "Oh, whaia, titiro," e hariko ana tamanui te rā, which means, look, whaia or auntie, the sun is happy, the sun is smiling. Or, for example, when I was working in a Māori school, you know, a child threw his rubbish on the ground, and one of the teachers said to him, "Kia kaua e whio o mea I runga ia papa tuanuku. Don't you throw your rubbish on our mother earth." And so I guess, I mean, that's an aspect of it, that we connect and with our external world, but also with each other. And so when we look at our family history, or our family tree, which we call whakapapa, we trace ourselves all the way back to the beginning, into the universe. I guess that's one reason why there might seem to be a lot more depth. And also we have a history of, we are an oral culture who enjoys wordplay, and on our marae, which is our meeting house, the ground in which we meet to discuss issues, men stand up and they do what we call tauparapara, which are kind of like poetic introductions. Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kaka, ka tangi hoki aho, ti hei mauri ora. The titi cries, the kaka cries, these are birds, and I therefore cry too. Ti hei mauri ora, and the breath of life, I am inspired by the breath of life to now speak. And so men stand on our marae and speak all of this beautiful, poetic, metaphoric language. And we, you know, grew up listening to this type of language all the time. I love reading ancient mōtiatia, which are like chants, because you can find all of these amazing literary devices within them, like metaphors or allusions, alluding back to, you know, battles before, or very similar to all, you know, literature around the world. But I guess, I think Barry Barclay talked about fourth cinema, and I'm not an expert on it, but, and probably Catherine will probably know a lot more about it, but I guess it's about the spiritual, the deeper spiritual connection to all things around you. And I remember when I was at high school studying English, and one literary device that we'd learnt was, I think it's called pathetic fallacy. And what it basically is that when a writer writes that, and she walked down the road, and the trees swayed, were smiling, or that's kind of more like a metaphor. But it's about the inner expression being transferred externally. And so I know when I write, I'm always looking for the deeper connection, and I always start with a spiritual idea around my work. For example, my first play, Ngā Manurere, literally means the flock. And I wrote this because I'm a single mother. I was 18 when I had my son, and I, you know, had seen, of course, a lot of negativity around being a single mother, and I had all these amazing single women around me who were just great mothers, And so how I looked at them metaphorically was as a flock of birds who move together as one, and sometimes that one leads and then that one, but no matter what, we all stay together. And that's how it was for my girlfriends and I. But we had a very, like, birds were always a big part of my family's life. My nana would always talk about the manu, or a bird. I mean, I'm wearing a bird now. And so when I looked at these women, I saw them as beautiful birds, and I perhaps that's got to do with the way that I grew up in my relationship, which my family fostered with all things around us, and feeling connected to that. But yeah, I guess, I mean, some of our great poets like Witi Himaira, writers, and plenty of amazing playwrights and screenwriters have this real sensitivity to the outside world, because perhaps it's because of those things I talked about, the connection to their wairuatanga or spirituality, and also to family.
Thank you. Thanks. Would you like to say something?
I also think that for all New Zealanders, there's such a big country comparatively and so few people, that you're always respectful of the landscape and the natural environment, because even very close to a city you can die in the forest, just because you can get lost. Nobody may have been there before. So I think, and the sea all around of us. So we learn to grow up very much part of our environment. The other thing I was going to say is, when I was growing up, nearly all literature, nearly all films, nearly all TV came from somewhere else. So my imaginative life, I had to imagine, everything was in the imaginary world. It didn't much reflect my own world. So I imagined some things completely wrong. I imagined squirrels were about, well, we have possums in New Zealand, so I imagined a squirrel was like a big possum, and with a proper tail. So you kind of found ways of relating to the domination. And although people would say, I think Claudia said, you know, British is your culture. Well, it is and it isn't. A lot of New Zealanders certainly came from Ireland and Scotland, which are also very oral, poetic cultures. And that, when I was at school, I would be reading French poetry, German poetry, English poetry. They were all the same. They were all from a distance. And stories, so languages, stories, all from overseas. And probably in the last 30, 40 years, there has been a great blossoming of our own literatures and music and art and stories.
That, oh yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like, as the next generation, I grew up with a lot of the Māori mythologies and Māori histories as something that was probably the strongest mythologies for me. But of course, all of the literature, or a lot of the literature of the world, and there is a thing, because New Zealand is a place of migration, you know, of people who have come from many different places, some a long time ago, some more recently. Yeah, everybody. And so for me there is a very strong pull of the other, of the other side of the world. Something that I've been thinking about being over here is, I have friends, you know, who live in Brussels or who live in England, and for them the centre of the universe is their hometown, is Brussels or something, and they would not consider going anywhere else for any extended period of time. Whereas I think for me, coming from New Zealand, in some ways the centre of the universe has not always been New Zealand, it's somewhere else, and so there's this sort of tug to go and discover the other side of the world, but at the same time I think there is a very strong sense of the natural world. Like if I'm away from New Zealand for too long, I start to mourn the ocean and the sound of the way that the waves break against the seashore, and the sort of the thin lightness of the air, as if you could sort of blow off. And so there's this sort of imaginative space, which is coming from the bottom of the earth, the end of the earth, and because there is that space, as Catherine mentioned, there is this room for your imagination. Like I didn't have television until I was 10, so I spent a lot of time in the forest, falling out of trees, imagining things. Yeah, there is that space. Yeah, and so I think stories grow from that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's sums it up very well. I do have another question because we've talked about it every now and then. The other side of that is that things don't translate well or get lost in translation and get lost in the distance to the rest of the world. Details from genuine New Zealand culture, genuine New Zealand storytelling, like the example with Boy, the film that opened the festival, is that after it premiered at Sundance, there was like someone was kind of in Variety, that film magazine, someone was saying that it's, to sum it up, it's like it's not really exotic enough. There's this expectation and idea of like a certain exoticism, and maybe Boy wasn't that a good example, but what I actually mean is like those fine-tuned details in storytelling that don't maybe have a reference point and get lost in translation. Also when you think of New Zealand as a former colony and British influenced. What is your experience with that, with your own films when they travel?
I'm pretty sure that the films that come from and reflect any culture don't entirely translate anywhere else. But it's layers, that the things that are universal will extend everywhere, and that you don't necessarily have to explain everything. So that even if you couldn't explain, say, some of the traditions in the orator or things in New Zealand, you understand the emotions. On the other hand, people who've grown up in Samoa respond to certain things instantly and very differently. Like they will laugh a lot at the coach talking about coming from when he was in Auckland. A taxi driver told me that, that fellow who made the film, a Samoan man, taxi driver, he said, that fellow who made the film, he must have grown up in Samoa. Even if he went to school in New Zealand, he must have spent time in Samoa. And I said, well, he actually spent till university in Samoa. What makes you think that? He said, we just got the little things right. And I went, imagining it would be cultural details. And he said, no, it was like, you know those chaps who come back from New Zealand and try and teach us how to play rugby? So it reflected a common experience. Now, we wouldn't really get that particularly if you weren't growing up in Samoa and resenting the people who came back from New Zealand and tried to tell you how things were done in a bigger country. So I don't really think it matters if you don't understand everything from every culture. I know that when I see a Japanese film, I don't understand everything, but the things I do understand is how much it enriches my life to experience it.
For me, I think what I with New Zealand films, for me it's a different experience because they are English language and they are not looking too foreign in the first side. So that I think for Europeans who have a more Anglo-Saxon concept in mind, some details are just unexpectedly missed out on because New Zealand does have a different culture than Canada or the UK. That's what I meant.
But I guess that what happens most of the time is we don't see our own culture on screen. So we're missing out on other people's nuances. So when we get our own nuances, that's very enriching.
And also I would say that that's a challenge for us. I think, countries like Denmark, who have or Iceland perhaps, or, sort of smaller countries that have a strong national sort of film culture. I think they can do that because they have a language that is specifically their language. So therefore, the audiences will go to be reminded of their culture through their own language. Whereas for us, there is that challenge because we are speaking English a lot of the time. And so it is about sort of going, okay, how can we really, rather than trying to compete with the big blockbuster American films which we will never be able to do, how do we really look into our own languages and our own stories and just sort of strengthen that and therefore have an identity that is beyond the language.
One thing that was really concerning for me in making Butterfly was I constantly asked myself the question, will international audiences be able to relate to these themes? And after it screened in Wairoa, Kanakan Balilingus, the Filipino filmmaker, his producer Jong said to me, I said, so you understood the film? It was the first time it screened, and he said, yes, it was about a girl who did da, 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 and then at the end, da, and I went, oh, hallelujah. He got the film, but that was a really big concern, and as Catherine was saying, ultimately it's like The Karate Kid is about a boy who gets, beaten up by bullies, who then overcomes the bullies and, gets the girl in the end. And that's set in America. But there's plenty of films with that same idea and structure that in all sorts of countries around the world. So it's making sure that the human story is strong enough and that's when it will translate. And all of the other cultural perspective stuff is, that's the unique. Somebody said to me, that's the formula for film, is that universal and something unique. But when it does translate and people do understand the ideas and themes, then you go, oh, hallelujah.
Thank you. We have to come to an end slowly, but please share your thought.
I was just going to say, I think we should be more confident that human beings all over the world actually have more in common than they have difference. And that, I guess maybe that's a very idealistic, from the bottom of the earth perception that we could all live happily together on this earth. But I do believe that the common things about being human are much greater than the things that separate us.
Thank you. Thanks. That's not very much more to say. Is there any questions from the audience? All answered. We will be around until the next screening. Please stay for Alyx film, The Red House, now at 8 o'clock. Have some refreshment and come to the cinema.
Yeah, so it's a love story set between a small, beautiful island in New Zealand and a big city in China.
It's amazing. It's basically also beautifully following up what Catherine just said in all ways. Yeah, so thank you very much for coming and being part. Thank you for listening, and hopefully see you in the cinema.